Allie with the Potomac Bead Company, and I'm going to be showing you how to do a very simple step bracelet to do a fringe style using and utilizing the Checkmate beams. The beams are a 3-hold bead, and we're going to be creating a zigzagging or a snaking effect using some 8/0 seed beads. I have a variety of Czech glass and some crystals and some seed beads sitting out here. Fundamentally, you'll be able to use anything to do this bracelet, and I'll show you some of the pinch beads that I have and small rondelles and some of the bicones, as well as the rice beads, and then I have some flower cups. So really a variety of beads can be used. Essentially, you will need the beams and you will need some 8/0 seed beads. From there, you can really kind of go wild and use all different types of beads that you would like to be utilized in the bracelet. For the actual bracelet, again, you're going to need the beams, the 8/0 seed beads, and then a variety of actual beads to go in between on this English Gardens bracelet. We have some thread here, and I'm using 0.006 wildfire thread. You can use white or green thread along with a size 10 English beading needle. I have a thread zap or a thread burner here, and that is to burn off the ends of the thread off the spool as well as finishing off the project. For the actual clasp, I have a nice garden clasp here. It's a push clasp and it's a 3-strand, which will work really nicely with those 3 strands of beams. This bracelet, once we start establishing the lines and then start with all this fringe, you really, like I said, can kind of establish and go on your own. So I'm not going to list out exactly everything that I'm using, but as I do each section, I'll present to you what beads I'm using in that section. To get started, we are going to start with our base. So you'll want your base beads, which are your 8/0 seed beads, your beams, and then some 11/0 seed beads and your clasp. Go ahead and put 5 feet of beading thread on your needle, and we'll get ready to start our actual base. To begin the project, I'm going to add a stop bead onto the thread. The stop bead is an 11/0 seed bead that I'm not using in my project. I just had an Aztec gold one here, and I'm going to drop down to the base of my thread, leaving about 3 inches at the end. I'm going to then take my needle and go 2 times around that seed bead, and that will hold the beads on the thread without it falling off. I will be adding the clasp as I do the rows here of the beams, but for this first one, just go ahead and put on a seed bead. The pattern now is going to be very simple. We're going to add 2 11/0 seed beads, and I have those in the emerald green. They're Toho, and they are the gold lustered emerald. So I have 2 11/0 seed beads on, and then our pattern is going to be 1 beam, 1 8, 1 beam. Our pattern then goes to 4 beams, or 4 8s rather, in between, and then another beam, 1 8, 1 beam. So you can see the pattern that is going to go the whole way down the base of the bracelet. This bracelet will have a tiny bit of a curvature. Once you get the beads on, it's going to pull it in a little bit, and it'll get a little bit shorter because it's going to be getting pulled into that V style. So I want you to go ahead and do your exact length of your bracelet, and then we'll add length as we add the clasp on. So again, just a progression of beam, 1 beam, 4 beads, and then starting over, beam, 1 beam, 4. So go ahead and do that the length of your wrist. So if your wrist is about 6 3/4 to 7 1/4 inches, go ahead and add that exact amount of your actual seed beads and your beams on. As you get to the end of your bracelet, you want to make sure that you're going to end opposite of the way that you began. So we began with our 1 seed bead. I'm going to end with 4 seed beads and then my last of my beams. When I'm ending the bracelet, I'm also going to add in those 2 11/0 seed beads and get ready to pick up my clasp. To pick up the clasp, you want to make sure that you're going on one of the ending loops of the clasp, because again, we're doing the first strand. So after I pick up the 11/0 seed beads, I'm going to go through the very end of the clasp and let that go the whole way down next to my project. As I go in and embellish the piece, then I'll be able to reinforce this and put more strands through the clasp. But from here, I'm going to go through my first seed bead out of those 2 seed beads. That adds that 1 in. And now what I'm going to do to get to the second hole is I'm going to add another 11-0 seed bead, and I'm going to go into the second hole of the beam. So again, I'm not connecting or catching onto the second hole of the clasp. I'm just catching onto that first hole and then creating a triangle with the seed beads getting in that clasp. From now, I'm going to go down and up the count. So we did have on 4 beads and then 1 bead. So you can do 3 and then going up to 2 and 3 and 2, that's up to you. I'm going to do my whole center line here as 2 beads. So between every single beam through the second hole, we're going to add 2 8-0 seed beads. So as I add 2, you're going to see that curve start to occur. So again, we're just sewing down the center row of the beams, adding in 2 8-0 seed beads, and then sewing into the next beam in line. And again, we'll start that snaking effect that we want to happen as we create our little English garden here. As you get to the end of the middle row, you're going to come and connect to the center loop of that 3-stranded clasp on the other side. So I'm going to pick up my 2 11-0 seed beads, and I'm going through the clasp, just like I've been doing with the other side. I'm going to go back through the 11-0, and again, remember, we're going to be coming back down through all of this center row again, so we'll be able to reinforce the clasp. And back through that first bead, just like I did the opposite side. Add an 11-0 seed bead on, and go through the last hole. So now my clasp is on one side and on the other side as well. From here, we're going to go back to that alternating pattern, which is going to make it a little bit, right now it's kind of curved. It's going to make it sit a little bit straighter, and those beams will go more into that curved shape. So again, wherever it is 2 beads below, we're going to be putting on 4. And then wherever we have the 4 already on the top, we're going to be putting on 1 bead. So we're just connecting to that last hole of the beam, going through and adding 4 beads above where it's the single at the base. And that's going to create that arch. And then adding on 1 single bead where there's already 4 on the opposite side. Now you can see that V shape that's starting to occur. This also is a great fun bracelet on its own if you wanted to do something very simple. You have a friend that wants to bead along with you as well while you're doing this fringe, or hasn't decided if they want to take that next step. This is a great one for them to do because you're just doing a counting here. So you can see the effect that you're getting of that zigzag as you go along, adding in the 4 beads and then the 1 bead straight down to the end to the opposite side. Then we'll go ahead and we'll hook into the last loop of this clasp, hook into the center, and then start with our embellishment. Coming out of the last hole then of our beam here, I'm going to put on my 2 11-0 seed beads and go into that 3rd loop on the clasp. Coming through that, you can see that nice beam going through in opposite directions. And I'm going to go back down through the first of the clasps there, or first of the 11-0 rather, coming out that last loop of the clasp. I'm going to add another 11-0, and I'm going to go back through the center hole of the beam. So again, we're going to end up with those 2 triangles there going through that you can see that center. Again, when I come back down, I'll loop onto the center loop and I'll reinforce those as well. So at this point here, you need to establish exactly what beads you want in what position. So in the little example piece, as I was playing around and getting the spacing correct, I put 2 flower cups next to one another. I wasn't crazy about that. I like how full it is, but I did want the effect of getting a variety of beads in there. And I felt like when you wear this on your wrist, they're all pushing up, and by the time you would add extra beads in there, it would be almost too full. So as it's laying down, you can see a lot of that underpass there, but really when it's on, all those flower cups are laying up. So what I decided was, again, to get that variety of beads. So I have flower cups, I have a bunch of Czech glass, I have some rondelles and some crystals as well. And each little section here, I'm going to alternate for this English garden, going in and kind of creating a garden-like look and effect. So for that, what we're going to be doing is adding in each section different beads. Now you can repeat those beads, you can use different beads in each one, you can use a variety, you can completely ignore the pattern underneath and just go with a simple fringe and have it all mixed together. That's up to you. We're going to go down the center of the piece first, adding in our fringe because our needle is naturally here. From adding the center of the fringe, then, we are going to go and add fringe on one side and fringe on the other. So you're going to have 3 rows of your beads. So go ahead and basically pile up the beads, figuring out exactly which order you want them to go in if you are doing the alternating like I'm going to be doing. I'm going to begin with a smaller bead so it's easier to go next to the clasp and you don't see it overwhelmed with the flower cups. And then my second section here will be flower cups, going in with some of the Czech glass then and another row of flower cups, etc. Along this center row, I'm going to be adding 3 pieces of my fringe, or 3 extra bead sections between every single one of my beams. I have 2 beads here, so I'm going to be adding a bead, going through an 8/0, adding a bead, going through an 8/0, and adding a bead. I have some 11/0 sitting out that can work as stoppers above the beads that you can use. So I have here some of the rondelles in the 3x5mm, and these are faceted Czech rondelles. I'm going to use an 11/0, then a rondelle, and then the 11/0. And the 11/0 that I'm using is a Miyuki 11/0 in the dyed hot pink silver-lined alabaster. That gives it a nice pop of brightness. Once I have those 3 beads on, I'm going to go back through the rondelle and the first seed bead, and then sew through that first 8/0. The key to doing this fringe is going to be doing a nice tight pull after each little beaded section, so that way you don't get a lot of extra thread showing. You're putting on your next grouping of your 3 beads, the 11, the rondelle, the 11, going back through then the rondelle and the 11, skipping the very outer bead. You can see that just sits on the top and sticks up. I'll do that one more time, and you can see already kind of that curvature going into action. Once you have the 3rd one on, you're going to go back through the rondelle and the 11 just like we've been doing, and then going through your beam, you're going to be coming out. So again, that's 3 beads that went on in that center section. And you can see because of the size of the bead, they're not sitting right in a row. They're kind of grouping up between those beams. That's the effect that you want. The next grouping that I have my flower cups. So I'm going to do the same thing. Then I'm going to put on a flower cup. And these are the Vitrail full flower cups. And I'm going to add one of those darker green beads to be my stopper bead. Go back through the flower cup, go through the 8/0, give a nice tight pull, making sure that you don't have any extra thread showing. Again, flower cup, through the base of that flower cup, on goes the 11, which acts as a stopper, back through the flower cup, through the next 8/0 in line. And that bead is just going to sit right in the middle there, making sure you don't have any extra thread showing. You can see already how quickly that fringe is progressing and how pretty it looks already. 11/0 goes on after the flower cup, back down through the flower cup, and back through the beam. I want to make sure that you don't have that extra thread showing by pushing it kind of in its place and giving a nice tight pull. So there's the first section just going through the middle bead. So you can see how nice and full it's going to be and how quickly you can progress adding your beads. So my next beads that I have out, I have some 2x3mm crystals that are going to add a nice smaller section. I have some O beads, and then I have some spiky button beads that I'll drop in next. After that, I'll go into one of the Czech glass, these pinched bicones, and continuing on adding in the different styles of the fringe. The next bead I'm going to add on is the spiky button. So I have rondelles, some flower cups, then some crystals, then some more rondelles with the O beads, and I'm going to add those spiky buttons. I wanted to show you how to do that because the spiky buttons, unlike the other ones that have kind of seed beads working as stoppers, do not. So I'm going to put an 11-0 seed bead on, then I'm going to sew on my spiky button, which works as a drop, put my other 11-0 on, and then sew through my bead. So it's almost working as like a teardrop. Sewing that on, and then that spiky button will sit right along the top there. And you don't even have to do the 11-0s on the sides, that's up to you. I really like the brightness that this hot pink bead is adding. I'm just adding the 11, then that spiky button, and then the 11. Making sure to sit and pull it so that I don't have any extra thread showing. And this is the magic blue color of that spiky button that I'm adding. And there I have that third one in place. So you can see kind of the fun feature that we're getting with the mixing of all of these different beads, which is really getting that English garden effect that I wanted. So as we come down the center then, when I come back along the top and the bottom, I'm going to be adding those same beads into the top and bottom of the different sections. So if you have those laying out, you can keep a couple out for those additions as we progress. So coming out the last bead here, that last 11-0 after the last beam, you can see the pattern that is starting to take shape there and the different beads in a line. And what we're going to do is loop on to the next loop of the clasp, which is going to be our ending. And I'm on the crystal end of the clasp, so I want to make sure that that crystal is sitting facing up on the project. I've come out of the last 11-0 seed bead of that beam, or after the beam. I'm going to add another 11-0 seed bead and sew through the bottom loop of the clasp. And that's going to pull that clasp in there towards that bottom end. And then coming out to the top of the clasp, I'm going to hook onto the 11-0 that's already there. Remember, ignoring that starter bead, 11-0. Kind of pushing that off to the side. And you can see then that's going to loop up to that outer loop on the clasp. From now we're going to go down the bottom row here of our beams and our 8-0s. And my thread is getting short, so I'm going to get ready to actually add another thread onto the project. But for this simple bead here, where it's the simple one bead, all we're going to add is one more bead. So we're going to add one bead right on top of the others. I'm going to go ahead and tie on some more thread onto my needle by just taking a new piece of my spool, or a new piece from the spool here. Take that spool cover off, pull some out, put the spool cover on, and go ahead and burn off that thread off the spool. You're going to take the new piece of thread and you're going to add it to the old piece. Take the needle off the old piece, hold on to that old end, and you're simply going to tie a knot. So it's really not that complicated. You're just going to tie a knot with the new thread onto the existing thread that is there. So I'm tying a loop here, making my knot. I'm going to pull that knot down close to the beads there, and then tie those two thread ends together. Whenever I tie or add thread onto the project, I always come back then and do the final kind of burning down. But what I do like to do is to get the thread out of the way, I'll just burn it down so I can see about 1/4 of an inch left on the thread. That'll keep me in place so I know exactly where it is. From there, I'll take a needle nose pliers, which are always nice to have handy. This is a wide jaw one. Flatten out the end of the thread there. And then I'll go in and actually thread my needle much quicker. Sometimes also then it's nice afterwards to grab that thread with the pliers and pull that onto the project. So again, because we're only at one bead here, we're going to be switching from 1 to 4, and we put 3 beads on the center row. We're only going to put 1 bead on where there is 1 bead. So here I have my progression of my 11-0, then my green rondelle, then my O bead, which looks like I need to get a couple more of those out here. And then an 11-0 that sits on top. So whatever that section is the same beads that you're going to add on to each little area. Going back through then here, I'm going to skip over the bead and go right in to the beam. What that's going to do is center that bead so that it's right over that single one. So the thread is almost going to arch over that single bead. And that gives a nice tight pull, and that puts that single bead there right on the bottom. Then we're going to come out here where we have our grouping of 4, and we're going to get ready to add our beads in there. Above the section of 4 beads, we are going to be adding 5 beads. So like we added 3 in the middle onto the 2, we're going to be adding 5 on where the beads are 4. And we're going to do those in the same exact way that we've been doing the beads along the middle. I'm adding my bead, sewing through the next 8-0 in line. Adding my bead, and in this case it's just 1 spiky button, and sewing through the next 8-0. So the rows where there are 4 beads, you're continuing on with the same technique of just adding a bead and then sewing through the next bead in line, which will give you an addition of 5 beads onto your little fringe section here. On the bead section where it's just the 1 bead, that's where we're hopping over top of the bead and we're just going to be going from beam to beam. So I'm getting my last spiky button in here and then sewing through the beam. And as I sew through the beam, you may need to kind of wiggle it around there. As I sew through the beam, I'm going to make sure I don't have lots of extra thread exposed, that it's not getting caught on anything else. You can see that grouping effect of that kind of garden there. And now I'm at the single bead section, so this again is where we change. I'm looking at the beads in front, so it has an O bead on it, then this Peridot Rondelle, then my 11-0 C bead. And then once those are on, I'm going to sew back down through the rondelle and the O bead, skipping over the 8-0 below it, and going into the next beam and right out. From there, then I'll go to the next section here and add on my rice-shaped beads in a grouping of 5 beads, adding a bead between each of my 8-0 C beads. Once you're done with that first outer side, I'll flip it over so you can see the effect. You're going to have a little bit of overhang where you put those beads of 5 counts. And that's okay because when you put it on your wrist, it's all going to sit towards the top. So you're not going to have to worry about that as you actually go in and put that on the top. So coming out the back here, we're going to reinforce the clasp by coming out the 11-0 seed bead. That's right after the beam. Then we're going to go through that one that sits right near that outer loop. Coming down then the clasp, and we're going to go up through the loop of the clasp. Come down the 11-0 that you just came through, and out through the 11-0 seed bead below it. So I kind of got that triangle going on. Then from there, I'm going to add an extra 2 seed beads to catch on to the middle loop. So from here, we're going to add 2 of our 11s on. We have 1, and then we're going to go up through the clasp or down, either way, it doesn't really matter. And then coming out that clasp, we're going to go to the opposite side. We're going to add another 11 and go down the 11 that sits right below it and out. Kind of looping around there. And that's going to fill in that clasp area with seed beads. We're going to reinforce one more time, going up through the 11 that we added, through the clasp, back to, not catch it onto the bead there, back to the other 11 that's there, and down towards the front and through. Now we already have the middle section done, so what we're going to do is we're going to reinforce this other loop of the clasp. You're going to sew over to the other loop by going through the 11-0 that sits along that triangle, going through the 11-0 near the clasp, and then from there we're going to sew through the loop of the clasp, down the 11-0 seed bead, and coming out the bar, or coming out the beam rather. So when you're out the beam here, we're going to repeat exactly what we did on the opposite side. So where there's 1, we're going to jump over and go through the beam. Where there are the 4 beads, we're going to add 5 of the same. And you're going to notice then even more so of that triangular effect that is going on here on the bracelet. So you're going to be adding in your beads. This one is seed bead, Rondelle seed bead, back through the 2 beads, and then out through the beam. Again, make sure as you're building, you just want to give a nice tight pull, that you don't have any extra thread showing. That's our first full section there between our beam, and now we're going to continue on adding in more of our flower cups and then our rondelles and our crystals and the funness of adding on the spiky buttons and continuing on with the rice and the pinch beads as well. As you progress along the design, you get to the end, and I just wanted to show you the back. You can see that zigzagging effect that's going on with the beams, and I'm coming out the last beam here after adding my last of my sections, and I'm adding 2 11-0 seed beads. Coming out that last hole, and I'm going to link onto the last hole of the clasp. Going through the clasp, and I'm going to go back down through those 2 beads that I just added, and I want to get a chance to reinforce and get more threads through. So I'm going to go up through the triangle here that sits next to it. We're going to reinforce that center clasp. And if you're using a regular button or cup button, what you can do is come through the project and connect your clasp or your button to the middle. And then on the ends, what you can actually do is just do a little section of the fringe on the 2 ends of the actual beads. What that allows you to do then is come through the project without actually having to worry about those loops and those holes. You're literally just adding another fringe right after. And as I go through here and come out, I'll reinforce, going through the loop again, coming down the opposite side, and use this opportunity also to kind of push that stop bead off one side. I'm going to zigzag over to the other one here, and then go up and loop through that 11-0 seed bead right near the clasp here as well. So if you can sew on a button, you can sew on a clasp. And just like a button, when you take multiple strands through of the thread, you want to do the same thing when you're sewing on a clasp. So I have the beads coming through there. I'm going to wiggle my seed beads back through here. And then you can bring the thread back down the project so you can get another loop through that clasp. And as you do that too, you can get to a point where you'll bring the thread back over and actually just tie off right on the end of that thread, the beginner thread. So if you want to, you can actually do a little tie now. So back through a little bit and then end your thread back through the project. So you're just going to pull off that starter thread, which started, remember, back at the beginning, going through our beams and adding our 1 bead and then our 4 bead. As you end the project also, it's going to be time for you to go ahead and grab your burner and burn some of your thread ends that you may have had. I actually added thread 3 total times, but again, I usually do not start with a full 5 feet because then it's harder to get on film and pulling through all of that. But as you end the project and do that burning down of the threads, which again, you can take them back in the project and then you really won't see them if you want. I'm going to be lazy and just do mine right at the end here because I have the green beads right next to the green thread. So you really won't see those thread ends. But the burner, if you don't have it, I would definitely suggest that's one of my essential beading tools that I work with. So go back into the project, find some of those thread ends that you may have, burn them down a little bit further, and tuck them into that fringe. And then after you are finished, you can kind of see that zigzagging effect too as you have the bigger beads and then kind of the smaller beads forming those triangles that they will sit inside of. Again, they do sit somewhat a little bit, some of them towards the back, but when you put it in and kind of wiggle it a little bit around on your wrist, let me bring that into focus here, you can actually see more of that triangular effect happening. And then the nice thing is with this project and with this style of a clasp, I'll be able to do it by myself and get that nice snap on with the clasp. So again, if you need any of the materials to do this fun bracelet, you can go back to the beginning of the video. I kind of listed out what I was using. But again, once you have the actual beams, you really can go wild creating with a bunch of different things. Now, you made sure that I used the flower cups because I wanted that look of an English garden, hence the name. But really this is a highlight too of those spiky button beads. They look great in here, and the same with those rice shaped and those pinch beads and some of those different Czech strands as well. So keep an eye out for fun things. This is also a great bracelet that if you have a lot of half tubes of things or half strands, this is a great way to use these up in a really, really fun decoration idea. So if you need, again, anything, we're happy to ship it to you from PotomacBeads.com and PotomacBeads.eu. Remember, again, below the video in that little timestamp that says when the video was created, we'll put links in there so you can purchase from us online as well. As always, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel and then you'll get regular updates from us when we come up with new designs, new patterns, new beads, and keeping you kind of in the loop with what's going on in the beading world. Also, feel free to stay connected with us on social media, and join our groups like our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. You can check us out also on Pinterest and Instagram and all those fun idea places as well. As always, I hope that this spurs your imagination, gets you into some designing mode, and gives you some great ideas for an easy fringe base using some awesome Czech glass and crystals. Thanks so much for watching and have fun creating.